Long before the Persian Empire carved its name into the chronicles of civilization, the vast Iranian plateau was home to scattered tribes, shifting alliances, and ancient cultures deeply rooted in the earth. The story of Persia does not begin with kings or palaces, but with the slow and steady movement of peoples, Indo-Iranian migrants who crossed immense landscapes, carrying with them the seeds of one of history's most remarkable empires. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, a broad group of Indo-European peoples began migrating from the steppes north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. Among them were the Indo-Iranians, ancestors of both the Indo-Aryans of India and the Iranian, peoples of what we now call Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. These migrations were not sudden invasions but gradual, wave-like movements shaped by shifting climates, conflicts, and the search for opportunity. Linguistically, the Indo-Iranians belonged to the larger Indo-European language family. Their tongues would later evolve into Sanskrit in India and Old Persian and Avestan in Iran. As they moved southward and eastward, the Indo-Iranians carried with them traditions of horse riding, a warrior-based social structure, and a belief system centered on natural forces and cosmic order. One of the earliest Iranian texts, the Avesta, preserves traces of these ancient beliefs and rituals. By the second half of the 2nd millennium BCE, some Indo-Iranian groups had begun to settle on the Iranian plateau. This vast region, bordered by mountains and deserts, offered both challenges and refuge. Over time, these settlers split into distinct tribes, the Medes, the Persians, the Parthians, and the Bactrians. Each occupied different territories and developed unique identities, though they remained connected through shared linguistic roots and cultural similarities. The Medes established themselves in the northwest, in the area now known as Media. The Persians, likely a smaller and less powerful tribe at the time, settled further south in a region called Parsa, known to the Greeks as Persis, and today as Fars in southern Iran. These early Iranian societies were tribal and loosely structured. Authority rested with local chieftains and life revolved around clan loyalty and kinship. Warfare, herding, and agriculture formed the core of existence. Yet even in this fragmented world, the seeds of empire had already been planted. Contact with older civilizations was key. To the west lay Mesopotamia, the land of cities, writing, and centralized power. Assyrians, Elamites, and Babylonians had long traditions of governance, monumental architecture, and record-keeping. To the east, connections with Central Asian cultures fostered trade and exchange. The Iranians did not exist in isolation. They absorbed, adapted, and eventually transformed the influences that surrounded them. One of the earliest non-Iranian civilizations in the region was Elam. Centered in the city of Susa, Elamite culture had thrived since the 3rd millennium BCE. Though distinct from the Iranian newcomers, the Elamites' proximity led to centuries of contact and exchange. Elamite script and administrative systems may have influenced later Persian governance, a legacy so deep that even under the Achaemenids, Elamite remained one of the empire's official languages. Meanwhile, to the northwest, the Assyrians began expanding aggressively during the 1st millennium BCE. As their empire pushed eastward, it came into contact and conflict with Iranian tribes dwelling in the Zagros Mountains. These encounters shaped the region's political evolution. The Medes, in particular, emerged as a confederation of tribes strong enough to challenge Assyrian domination. Assyrian records describe campaigns against the Medes, portraying them as fierce mountain warriors. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, the Medes were becoming increasingly organized. Later accounts suggest that by the 7th century BCE they had formed a kingdom with a capital at Ecbatana, modern-day Hamadan. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, a man named Deioces united the Median tribes and founded the first Median state. Though his narrative includes mythic elements, it reflects an underlying truth. The Medes were developing centralized authority. Herodotus claimed Deioces gained prominence through his reputation for justice and order, and that he built Ecbatana as his capital. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of Ecbatana as a major early city, though its initial scale remains debated. What mattered most was that independent tribes were now uniting under one banner. Deioces was succeeded by his son, Phraortes, who, according to Herodotus, expanded Median control by conquering nearby peoples, including the Persians. At this stage, the Persians were politically subordinate to the Medes, serving as vassals within their growing dominion. Thus, even before Persia's rise, its foundations were being shaped under Median influence. The Medes had become the dominant Iranian power. Their ascent coincided with the decline of Assyria, which, though still formidable, was crumbling from within, plagued by rebellions, stretched resources, and the hatred of subjugated nations. Among its rivals were the Babylonians, long resentful of Assyrian tyranny. It was during the reign of the Median king Cyaxares, ruling in the early 6th century BCE, that the Medes emerged as a decisive military power. Cyaxares reorganized his army into specialized units: spearmen, archers, and cavalry, a tactical innovation that allowed his forces to rival the disciplined Assyrian legions. Around 612 BCE, Cyaxares formed a historic alliance with Babylon's king Nabopolassar. Together, they launched a relentless campaign against the faltering Assyrians. After a brutal siege, the coalition captured and destroyed Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. The once feared empire collapsed, its remnants scattered across the Near East. The fall of Nineveh marked a turning point in history, the end of Assyrian supremacy and the rise of new powers. In the aftermath, the Medes claimed much of northern Mesopotamia and eastern Anatolia, while the Babylonians expanded southward. For a brief but significant time, the Median Empire stood as one of the most powerful kingdoms of the ancient world. Its reach extended from the Halis River in central Anatolia to the western edges of Iran, encompassing a mosaic of peoples: Armenians, Cappadocians, Persians, and others. Yet, despite its vastness, the Median state lacked the sophisticated administration that would later define the Persian Empire. It remained a confederation held together by alliances, marriages, and military might, rather than a cohesive bureaucratic system. Cyaxares was succeeded by his son Astyages, the last king of the Medes. His reign began in the late 6th century BCE, and though he inherited a vast realm, it was a fragile one, strong in appearance, yet vulnerable from within. And from within that vulnerability, a new power was quietly preparing to rise, a power that would soon eclipse the Medes, and in doing so, reshape the destiny of the ancient world. Internally, the Medes faced the growing challenge of holding together their diverse and often restless subjects. Externally, their alliance with Babylon had weakened, and new dangers were beginning to surface. Among them came an unexpected threat from a familiar source: their former vassals, the Persians. At this time, the Persians were led by a young and ambitious ruler named Cyrus, a member of the Achaemenid dynasty. He was the grandson of Astyages through his mother Mandane, and thus carried both Median and Persian royal blood. According to later traditions recorded by historians such as Herodotus and Xenophon, Astyages attempted to suppress Cyrus early in his life, fearing that he would one day challenge his rule. Though these stories are colored by legend, they reveal real political tensions beneath the surface. Cyrus eventually rose in rebellion against Median domination, a revolt born from a blend of ambition, resentment, and the desire to unite the Iranian peoples under a new banner. The conflict between Cyrus and Astyages culminated in a decisive battle around the mid-6th century BCE. According to Babylonian sources, particularly the Nabonidus Chronicle, Cyrus defeated Astyages and captured Ecbatana. This was more than just the fall of a kingdom. It was the dawn of an empire. The victory of Cyrus ended the Median kingdom and gave birth to the Persian Empire, marking one of the greatest turning points in ancient history. The Medes, once the dominant power, were now absorbed into a new political order. Yet they did not vanish. Many Median nobles and administrators continued to serve under Cyrus, helping to shape the early Achaemenid government. The fall of the Medes also introduced a new model of empire, one that ruled not merely by fear, but by inclusion, structure, and balance. Cyrus learned from the successes and failures of the Medes, and from that foundation he built something far more enduring. The fall of the Median kingdom cleared the way for one of history's most extraordinary figures, Cyrus, the Persian ruler, who had overthrown his Median grandfather, would go on to unite the Iranian peoples and lay the foundations for what would become the largest empire the world had ever seen. His rise was swift, calculated, and transformative, ushering in a new era that reshaped the ancient Near East. Cyrus was born into the Achaemenid dynasty, a relatively minor noble house among the Persian tribes. His father, Cambyses I, was the local ruler of Anshan in southwestern Iran, and his mother, Mandane, was the daughter of Astyages, the Median king. This heritage granted Cyrus both Persian legitimacy and Median royal blood, strengthening his claim to power. Though ancient accounts, especially those of Herodotus, fill his youth with myth and prophecy, history tells us that Cyrus came to power as king of Anshan in the mid-6th century BCE, likely following his father's death. At that time, Persia was still under Median control, but discontent was brewing. The precise details of Cyrus's rebellion remain debated, but Babylonian records confirm that by the mid-550s BCE, he had launched a campaign against Astyages. The war involved not only battlefield clashes, but also internal betrayal. Herodotus recounts that Harpagus, one of Astyages' generals, defected to Cyrus, tipping the scales in his favor. Astyages was ultimately defeated and captured. Instead of erasing the Median system, Cyrus absorbed it. He made Ecbatana one of his royal capitals and kept many Median officials in office. By doing so, he preserved stability while asserting Persian supremacy, a reflection of his pragmatic and diplomatic nature. With the Medes subdued, Cyrus looked outward. His vision extended far beyond uniting Iran. Over the next decade, he embarked on campaigns that expanded Persian power across continents. The first great conquest came in the west, the kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia. Lydia, ruled by the wealthy King Croesus, was famed for its gold, its luxury, and its influence. Croesus, confident in his alliances with Babylon, Egypt, and Sparta, underestimated the rising Persian power. Around the mid-540s BCE, Cyrus marched west. After a hard-fought engagement at the river Halys, known as the Battle of Thymbra, Croesus retreated to Sardis, assuming the war was over for the season. But Cyrus moved swiftly, besieging Sardis before Croesus could recover. The city fell in a short time, and Croesus was captured. Lydia's defeat was more than a military victory. It brought immense wealth and control over the Ionian Greek cities on the Aegean coast, setting the stage for centuries of interaction and conflict between Persia and Greece. It also showcased Cyrus's unique style of warfare, rapid, decisive, and followed by mercy and integration rather than destruction. After securing the west, Cyrus turned east. His campaigns into Central Asia, brought the nomadic tribes and distant territories of Bactria and Sogdiana under Persian influence. Among these eastern wars, one stands out: his campaign against the Massagetæ, a fierce tribal confederation ruled by Queen Thamyris. The accounts differ, with some claiming Cyrus perished in battle, while others suggest he survived and later died elsewhere. But his eastern conquests firmly extended Persian authority into Central Asia. Perhaps Cyrus's most famous triumph, however, was the capture of Babylon. By 539 BCE, Babylon was ruled by Nabonidus, a king whose religious reforms and long absences had angered priests and citizens alike. Cyrus seized the opportunity. Marching into Mesopotamia, he presented himself not as an invader, but as a restorer of order. According to the Cyrus Cylinder, often called the First Declaration of Human Rights, he claimed divine approval from Marduk, Babylon's chief god, and promised to protect the city's traditions. When the Persian army entered Babylon, they met little resistance. Nabonidus was overthrown, and Cyrus was hailed as a liberator. He restored temples, honored local gods, and allowed exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands. Such acts of tolerance earned him immense respect across the ancient world. By the end of his reign, Cyrus ruled a realm stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. But unlike the empires that had come before, his was not built solely on fear or conquest. It rested on respect for culture, for faith, for diversity. He did not impose Persian ways on others, but allowed each province to keep its customs, language, and religion, provided they remained loyal. This policy required careful administration, and Cyrus laid the groundwork for it by appointing satraps, provincial governors, to oversee regions under imperial oversight. He developed networks of roads and messengers that would later evolve into the famous Royal Road. He established systems of tribute and taxation, balancing autonomy with unity. Cyrus the Great died around 529 BCE, likely in battle in the east. He was buried at Pasargadae in a simple but majestic tomb that still stands. According to ancient writers, an inscription once read, "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come, I am Cyrus, who founded the Persian Empire. Do not begrudge me this bit of earth that covers my body." Though his life ended, his legacy endured. He was more than a conqueror. He was a creator, a lawgiver, and a visionary. Cyrus's model of leadership, pragmatic, just, and inclusive, would echo through centuries, inspiring rulers and philosophers alike. Upon his death, the throne passed to his son, Cambyses II. This succession marked a new phase in Persian history. Where Cyrus had united and organized, Cambyses would seek to expand and conquer. He inherited an empire vast and stable, yet demanding vigilance. Before setting out on any great campaign, Cambyses consolidated his rule at home, ensuring loyalty among satraps, commanders, and nobles. Once secure, he turned his gaze toward Egypt, the ancient land of pharaohs, wealth, and mystery. Though long past its golden age, Egypt remained powerful and proud, and soon it would face the unstoppable might of Persia's new generation. Diana, its influence had faded. The ruling dynasty, the 26th, based in Sais, faced mounting pressure from both internal factions and external rivals. At the time, the Egyptian pharaoh was Psamtik III, a young and relatively inexperienced king who had only recently ascended the throne. His father, Amaris, had maintained cordial relations with Cyrus the Great. But following Amaris's death, those ties began to unravel. According to Herodotus, Cambyses used a combination of military might and strategic alliances to prepare for his campaign in Egypt. One major factor in the success of the Persian invasion was naval power. Persia had little maritime tradition, but Cambyses formed alliances with coastal peoples such as the Phoenicians and the Carians, who provided ships and seafaring expertise. This gave Cambyses a logistical advantage, allowing him to transport troops and supplies across the eastern Mediterranean. He also secured cooperation from Arab tribes in the Sinai Peninsula, who assisted in providing water and provisions for the desert crossing. This support was crucial, as the eastern route into Egypt was harsh and unforgiving. Without local aid, the campaign would have been far more difficult. In 525 BC, Cambyses launched his invasion. The decisive encounter took place near the city of Pelusium at the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. Herodotus and later sources claim that Cambyses employed a clever psychological tactic. He reportedly ordered his troops to carry images of cats and other animals sacred to the Egyptians, hoping that the Egyptian soldiers would hesitate, fearing they might offend their gods. Whether this tactic was truly used or not, the battle resulted in a Persian victory. Psamtik III fled, but was soon captured and brought before Cambyses. Egypt, once a proud and independent kingdom, became a province of the Persian Empire. Cambyses assumed formal control and took the title of pharaoh. This was more than symbolic. By presenting himself as a legitimate ruler in Egyptian eyes, Cambyses sought to maintain order and reduce the risk of rebellion. He respected traditional religious practices and offered patronage to Egyptian temples. At the same time, he appointed Persian officials to key administrative positions, blending local customs with imperial oversight. Despite these efforts, Cambyses' rule in Egypt was not universally welcomed. Resistance simmered beneath the surface, and his reputation in Egyptian sources was far less favorable than in Persian or Greek accounts. Some Egyptian records portray Cambyses as disrespectful and impious, accusing him of desecrating sacred sites and executing priests. These reports may reflect real tensions or be exaggerated by later writers hostile to foreign rule. Beyond Egypt, Cambyses reportedly planned further campaigns into Nubia and the Siwa Oasis, aiming to expand Persian control deeper into Africa. However, these expeditions achieved limited success. Harsh terrain, logistical challenges, and unreliable local support hindered Persian advances. One force sent toward the Siwa Oasis is said to have vanished in a sandstorm, though this account remains unverified. While Cambyses was in Egypt, events in Persia took a dramatic and unexpected turn. In 522 BCE, news reached Cambyses that a man claiming to be his brother Bardia, known in Greek sources as Smerdis, had seized the throne. According to the official Persian account, Cambyses had secretly ordered Bardia's death before departing for Egypt, fearing a challenge to his authority. The man now claiming the throne, according to this narrative, was an impostor named Gaumata, a Magian priest posing as Bardia. The sudden rise of this so-called false Bardia triggered a crisis. Cambyses began his journey back to Persia to reclaim power, but he died en route under mysterious circumstances. Some accounts suggest an accidental wound from his own sword. Others hint at suicide or assassination. Whatever the truth, his death plunged the empire into chaos. Cambyses' reign was brief but consequential. He had expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent yet, incorporating Egypt and reinforcing Persian dominance across the known world. Yet he also left instability, unresolved tensions, and a dangerous power vacuum. By 522 BCE, the Persian Empire stood at a crossroads. Cambyses too was dead, possibly by his own hand. An unknown man claiming to be Bardia, the son of Cyrus the Great, now sat on the throne. Across the empire, satraps and local leaders were uncertain. Some pledged loyalty, others prepared to rebel. The unity that Cyrus had built and Cambyses had extended teetered on the edge of collapse. Amid this uncertainty, a figure emerged who would restore stability and elevate the empire to new heights. His name was Darius, known to history as Darius the Great. Though not a direct son of Cyrus, Darius would prove a master of organization, vision, and governance. Under his leadership, Persia would become not only vast but efficient, wealthy, and truly imperial in structure. Darius hailed from a noble Persian family, belonging to the Achaemenid line, though from a junior branch. His father, Hystaspes, had governed Parthia under Cyrus. Darius himself had served in the royal court, likely as part of the king's elite guard, the Immortals. He was in Egypt when Cambyses died and returned to Persia as the political crisis intensified. According to Darius's own account, inscribed on the Behistun inscription carved into a cliffside in western Iran, the man claiming to be Bardia was in fact an impostor named Gaumata. Darius, with 6 Persian nobles, assassinated him and seized power. The inscription presents this as an act of noble restoration, defending the rightful line and eliminating a usurper. Modern historians debate the truth. It is possible that the real Bardia had been secretly murdered, and Gaumata's only crime was claiming the throne. Regardless, Darius used this story to justify his takeover, asserting divine support from Ahura Mazda, the supreme Zoroastrian god. Darius's first challenge was survival, not legitimacy. The empire erupted in revolts across all directions. In Elam, Babylon, Media, and beyond, local rulers declared independence or pledged to rival claimants. Within a single year, Darius and his generals fought 19 battles to suppress the uprisings. Each victory was recorded in the Behistun inscription, detailing the names of rebels, their lands, and how they were defeated. Through force and political skill, Darius restored control. But he recognized that brute strength alone could not ensure unity. He established a lasting administrative system that would define Persian imperialism for generations. The empire was divided into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap. Satraps were usually Persian nobles entrusted with collecting tribute, maintaining order, and reporting to the king. To prevent rebellion or corruption, each satrap was overseen by royal inspectors and military officers loyal directly to the throne. This system, described by the Greeks as the king's eyes and ears, allowed distant regions to be effectively monitored. Tribute collection was standardized. Each satrapy paid a fixed amount annually, often in silver, horses, or agricultural products. The system stabilized the economy and enabled the state to plan expenditures and maintain a standing army. Herodotus lists 20 satrapies, stretching from Libya to the Indus Valley. To support this vast administration, Darius invested heavily in infrastructure. He commissioned the Royal Road, connecting Sardis in Anatolia to Susa in Persia, stretching over 1,500 miles. The road included rest stations, relay posts, and security patrols, allowing messages to travel across the empire in days, enhancing administration, trade, and military readiness. Darius also introduced standardized coinage. He issued a gold coin called the daric and a silver equivalent bearing the king as an archer, accepted across the empire. A common currency stimulated trade and unified diverse economic systems. Monumental architecture was another focus. Darius built a new ceremonial capital at Persepolis on a grand terrace with massive columns and carved reliefs depicting delegations from across the empire. Audience halls allowed the king to receive tribute and demonstrate imperial unity. Construction continued under successors, but Darius set the artistic and symbolic tone. In addition to Persepolis, Darius maintained Susa and Babylon as centers of power and culture. He did not erase local traditions, but incorporated them into a broader imperial identity. Religiously, Darius promoted Zoroastrianism while respecting other faiths. His inscriptions consistently invoke Ahura Mazda, emphasizing the divine source of his rule and the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood. Unlike later religious states, he did not impose Zoroastrianism on his subjects. The empire's strength lay in tolerance and adaptability. One ambitious project was in Egypt, where Darius reopened a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, connecting Egypt to Indian Ocean trade. Originally begun by earlier Egyptian rulers, the canal was completed under Persian supervision. Inscriptions along its route credit Darius as the king who united two seas. His interest in exploration extended beyond Persia. Darius reportedly sent expeditions to study the Indus River and explore Central Asia. He understood that knowledge was power and that geography was vital for trade and military strategy. Despite these achievements, Darius's reign faced challenges. His growing attention to the Greek world would soon draw Persia into a long and costly conflict. In the late 6th century BCE, the Ionian Greeks under Persian rule revolted. The cities of Ionia, along the western Anatolian coast, had long resented imperial control. With support from Athens and Eretria, they launched a rebellion. Though the revolt was eventually crushed, it enraged Darius and revealed the vulnerability of Persian control in the west. Determined to punish Athens and restore imperial authority, Darius prepared a military campaign that would take Persia across the Aegean and into the heart of Greece. By the close of the 6th century BCE, the Persian Empire had expanded to cover an immense and diverse territory, from the Indus River in the east to the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west. Under Darius the Great, the empire had become not only vast, but administratively sophisticated, economically integrated, and culturally tolerant. Yet, despite its apparent stability, challenges were beginning to emerge on the empire's far western frontier. These challenges would spark a new and enduring conflict, the Persian Wars with the Greek city-states. The roots of the conflict lay in the coastal region of Ionia, located in what is now western Turkey. The Ionian Greeks had established colonies there centuries earlier, and by the 6th century BCE, cities such as Miletus, Ephesus, and Smyrna had become wealthy centers of commerce and culture. However, these cities had fallen under Persian rule following the conquest of Lydia by Cyrus the Great. While Persia allowed these cities a degree of local autonomy, they were required to pay tribute and accept Persian-appointed tyrants. Local rulers loyal to the empire, over time, resentment among the Ionians grew. They saw the imposition of tyrants as a violation of their traditional values, which favored self-rule and civic participation. The friction between imperial oversight and Greek political identity proved explosive. The immediate spark for the Ionian revolt came in the city of Miletus, where the local tyrant Aristagoras found himself in a precarious political position. Hoping to strengthen his standing, Aristagoras launched a military expedition against the island of Naxos with Persian support. The campaign failed, and fearing retribution, Aristagoras turned against Persia and encouraged the Ionian cities to rebel. In the year 500 BCE, the revolt erupted. The Ionian cities expelled their tyrants and declared independence from Persian rule. Aristagoras, seeking allies, traveled to mainland Greece and appealed to Athens and Eretria. Both cities, wary of Persian expansion and sympathetic to fellow Greeks, sent ships and troops in support. The most dramatic moment of the early revolt came with the joint Greek-Ionian attack on Sardis, the Persian regional capital. The city was set ablaze, and although the main fortress remained in Persian hands, the attack deeply angered Darius. Herodotus writes that when Darius learned of Athenian involvement, he called for a bow, fired an arrow into the sky, and vowed vengeance upon Athens. He is said to have ordered a servant to remind him daily, "Master, remember the Athenians." The Persian response was swift. Over the next several years, Darius dispatched forces to suppress the rebellion. The Persians regained control city by city, using both military force and political negotiation. By 494 BCE, the revolt was effectively over. The decisive battle came at Lade, a naval engagement near Miletus. Despite early promise, the Ionian fleet collapsed due to internal divisions, and the Persians crushed the resistance. Miletus itself was sacked, and its population deported inland as punishment. While the revolt had been suppressed, the deeper conflict was just beginning. Darius had not forgotten Athens and Eretria's role in supporting the Ionians. Their interference had revealed the vulnerability of Persian positions in the Aegean and challenged the authority of the great king. In response, Darius began planning a full-scale campaign to bring the Greek mainland under Persian control. The first expedition, launched in 490 BCE, was led by the Persian generals Datis and Artaphernes. Their fleet sailed across the Aegean, first stopping at Naxos, which they captured and burned in retribution. Next, they moved against Eretria, which fell after a brief siege. The city was plundered and its population deported, just as the people of Miletus had been. From there, the Persian force sailed to the Bay of Marathon, northeast of Athens. There, they landed and prepared to advance on the city. The Athenians, though outnumbered, chose to confront the invaders on the plain rather than remain behind city walls. They were led by the general Miltiades, a seasoned strategist who had previously served under Persian command in the Chersonese. The Battle of Marathon became one of the most celebrated engagements in ancient history. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the Athenians launched a daring frontal assault. The center of their line initially buckled under Persian pressure, but the flanks held strong and enveloped the enemy. The result was a stunning Greek victory. Thousands of Persian soldiers were killed or captured, while Athenian losses were comparatively light. The psychological impact of Marathon was enormous. For the Greeks, it proved that the Persians, despite their vast empire and feared army, could be defeated in open battle. For the Persians, it was a temporary setback, but one demanding serious reassessment. Darius, though still powerful, now faced a determined and capable enemy on the western edge of his empire. In the years following Marathon, he began preparing a larger and more decisive campaign. He intended to invade Greece with an even greater force, aiming not only to punish Athens, but to bring the entire region under Persian control. However, his plans were interrupted by unrest in Egypt, which had revolted against Persian rule. Before he could resolve the Egyptian crisis or renew the campaign in Greece, Darius died in 486 BCE. The task of continuing his imperial ambitions fell to his son and successor, Xerxes. Darius's death marked a turning point in Persian history. Xerxes ascended the throne at a time when the empire stood unrivaled in size and wealth, yet its western frontier had been shaken by Greek defiance. He inherited not only his father's vast dominion, but also the ambition to subdue the Greeks once and for all. Xerxes was the son of Darius and Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great. This made him heir not only to an imperial legacy, but to the memory of Persia's founding generation. Early in his reign, he faced internal matters that delayed his military plans. Egypt had revolted, and Xerxes had to restore order before turning west. Once Egypt was pacified, preparations began for a massive campaign against Greece. Unlike his father's limited expedition, Xerxes envisioned a grand invasion designed not only to punish Athens and its allies, but to bring the entire Greek mainland under Persian control. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Herodotus, the main source for the Greco-Persian Wars, describes the preparations in detail. Xerxes spent several years organizing the invasion, constructing supply depots, recruiting soldiers from across the empire, and famously building a canal through the Athos Peninsula to allow ships safe passage. This canal, dug by forced labor, was a logistical marvel and a demonstration of Persian ambition. Perhaps most symbolically, Xerxes ordered the construction of two massive pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. When the first bridges were destroyed by a storm, Xerxes, in a display of imperial wrath, reportedly ordered the sea to be whipped with chains and cursed. Though dramatic, the episode reflects the central theme of Persian kingship, the conquest of nature in service of imperial order. By the spring of 480 BCE, the army and navy were assembled. The Persian land forces, drawn from dozens of ethnic groups across the empire, were immense. Though numbers are debated, Herodotus claims hundreds of thousands of infantry and cavalry supported by a fleet of over 1,000 ships. Even if exaggerated, the invasion force was among the largest the ancient world had ever seen. Xerxes led the army in person, crossing the Hellespont and marching through Thrace and Macedonia into Greece. Many Greek states, fearing Persia, chose to submit. Others, including Athens and Sparta, resolved to resist. The first major encounter came at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. A small Greek force, led by the Spartan king Leonidas, attempted to delay the Persian advance. The pass was narrow enough to neutralize the Persian numerical advantage. For 2 days, the Greeks held their ground. The Spartans, renowned for discipline and training, fought fiercely alongside contingents from Thespiae, Thebes, and other cities. However, a local resident named Ephialtes betrayed the Greeks by revealing a mountain path that allowed the Persians to outflank them. Realizing they were surrounded, Leonidas dismissed most Greek forces and remained with a small rear guard, including his famed 300 Spartans. They fought to the death, delaying the Persians enough for Greek allies to regroup further south. Though a tactical defeat, Thermopylae became a symbol of courage and sacrifice. It demonstrated that Persian power could be resisted, and that Greek unity, however fragile, was possible. Following Thermopylae, the Persians advanced rapidly. They entered Boeotia and captured Athens, which had been evacuated. Xerxes ordered the burning of the Acropolis, a symbolic act meant to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Yet the Greek fleet, led by the Athenian general Themistocles, remained intact and prepared for battle in the narrow straits of Salamis. Themistocles devised a strategy exploiting the narrow waterways. He sent a deceptive message to Xerxes claiming the Greeks planned to retreat. Eager to crush the remaining resistance, Xerxes ordered his fleet into the straits. The crowded conditions favored the smaller, more maneuverable Greek ships. In the ensuing Battle of Salamis, the Persian navy suffered a disastrous defeat. Greek ships rammed and disabled larger Persian vessels, spreading confusion among the imperial ranks. Xerxes, watching from a nearby hillside, witnessed a significant portion of his fleet destroyed. The loss at Salamis marked a turning point. Though the Persian army remained formidable, the naval defeat made further operations in southern Greece difficult. Xerxes decided to withdraw most of his forces and return to Asia, leaving the general Mardonius in command of a smaller force to continue the campaign. The following year, in 479 BC, events continued to unfold in the struggle between Persia and Greece. In 479 BCE, a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens, Sparta, and Corinth, assembled a large land force and confronted the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. The Persians were decisively defeated. On the same day, according to tradition, the Greek navy scored another victory at Mycale in Asia Minor, further weakening Persian control in the Aegean. These defeats effectively ended the Persian invasion of Greece. While the empire remained vast and powerful, it had failed to subdue the fiercely independent Greek polis. The balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean was beginning to shift. In the years that followed, Persia continued to exert influence over Greek affairs, often through diplomacy and financial support for rival city-states. However, the myth of Persian invincibility had been shattered. The wars had demonstrated the limits of imperial power, particularly in regions where geography, local identity, and political structures favored resistance. For the Greeks, these victories became foundational myths, reinforcing their belief in freedom, civic virtue, and military courage. For the Persians, the wars were costly ventures that revealed the challenges of overreach and the unpredictability of distant campaigns. Xerxes spent the remainder of his reign managing affairs within the empire. He continued ambitious building projects at Persepolis and Susa, maintaining the grandeur of the royal court. Yet his ambitions of conquering Greece had been thwarted. His assassination in the mid-5th century BCE brought an end to his reign, and his successors would adopt a more cautious approach to Western foreign policy. The defeat of Xerxes' invasion marked a critical transition in Persian history. Though the military had suffered losses in Greece, the empire itself remained vast, wealthy, and intact. Its core territories were secure, and its administrative system continued to function. Yet the costly campaigns and shifting dynamics in the Aegean forced a strategic pivot, focusing more on stability, diplomacy, and selective intervention rather than outright conquest. After returning from Greece, Xerxes turned inward. He resumed construction projects, particularly at Persepolis and Susa, reinforcing royal authority and celebrating Persian grandeur. These architectural efforts included audience halls, palace complexes, and elaborate reliefs depicting the empire's diverse peoples bringing tribute to the king. The message was clear. Despite setbacks, the Persian Empire remained the center of power and civilization. However, the western frontier had grown more volatile. The Greek city-states, emboldened by victories at Salamis and Plataea, began asserting greater independence and expanding their influence. Athens, in particular, emerged as a naval power and took the lead in organizing a new alliance known as the Delian League. Originally formed to defend against future Persian aggression, the League gradually transformed into an Athenian empire in all but name. Persian responses were cautious but deliberate. Rather than launching another large-scale invasion, the kings, beginning with Xerxes' successor Artaxerxes I, relied on diplomacy, economic influence, and proxy conflicts to maintain their interests in the region. Artaxerxes I, who ascended the throne after Xerxes' assassination, ruled for over 40 years. His reign focused on managing relations with the Greek world while preserving internal stability. One notable policy was supporting rival Greek factions to divide and weaken their alliances. This divide-and-rule approach proved effective. During the mid-5th century BCE, Athens found itself in conflict with several Greek states, including Sparta. Persia, observing these rivalries, provided support to whichever side best served its interests at the time. For instance, Persia backed Sparta during certain phases of the Peloponnesian War, undermining Athenian dominance without deploying Persian troops directly. At the same time, Persia reinforced its hold on Asia Minor, the region most affected by the Ionian Revolt decades earlier. Persian satraps in Lydia and Caria maintained close control over the coastal cities, balancing suppression with cooperation. Local elites were often allowed to govern under Persian oversight, as long as they remained loyal and paid tribute. One of the most prominent Persian officials in the West during this period was Tissaphernes, satrap of Lydia and Caria. He played a key role in managing relations with the Greeks and negotiating with Athens and Sparta. His work reflected a broader Persian strategy: avoid overextension while using wealth and diplomacy to maintain influence. Meanwhile, internal strains began to surface. The satrapal system, while effective for administering distant provinces, granted regional governors considerable autonomy. Some satraps acted as semi-independent rulers, collecting taxes and raising armies for their own purposes. Though nominally loyal, their growing power posed long-term challenges to central authority. These tensions were evident in regions such as Egypt, which experienced multiple revolts during the 5th century BCE. While some uprisings were suppressed easily, others required significant military efforts. In some cases, rebels received support from Athens, adding a layer of geopolitical complexity. Despite these challenges, the administrative system remained resilient. The empire's ability to collect tribute, maintain trade routes, and deploy military force allowed it to endure. Persian roads facilitated communication and commerce, while the royal court remained a hub of political and cultural life. Persian influence extended beyond politics and military might. Throughout the 5th century BCE, Persian art, ideas, and customs flowed into the Mediterranean world. Greek artists and architects borrowed elements of Persian design, while Persian luxury goods, textiles, spices, and precious metals were highly prized in Greek markets. Yet, for all its achievements, the empire became increasingly reactive in foreign policy. The memory of defeat in Greece lingered, and subsequent kings appeared reluctant to risk large-scale engagements in the West. Instead, they focused on preserving what had been gained and avoiding further humiliation. the reign of Artaxerxes. I was followed by shorter reigns and internal succession struggles. Though not entirely destabilizing, these transitions gradually eroded centralized power. Satraps became more assertive, court factions grew influential, and royal authority became harder to enforce across the empire. Still, core principles endured. The empire's tolerance of cultural and religious diversity fostered loyalty among subjects. Zoroastrianism remained dominant at court, but local traditions, from Mesopotamian temple worship to Egyptian priesthoods, were respected and often supported financially. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire remained the most powerful political entity in the known world. It had survived wars with Greece, internal revolts, and shifting alliances. But the geopolitical landscape had changed. The rise of Athens, Sparta's growing strength, and the fragmentation of Greek politics created new opportunities and threats. The Persian court remained engaged but no longer dictated terms. With the same confidence that marked the reigns of Darius or the early years of Xerxes, the western frontier had become a zone of negotiation, compromise, and occasional conflict, managed not through overwhelming force, but through strategic patience. While military campaigns and rivalries dominate historical narratives, the enduring legacy of the empire was as much cultural and administrative as it was military. During this period of relative stability, the empire reached the height of its artistic, architectural, and bureaucratic development. Imperial identity was expressed not through expansion, but through refinement, through monuments, language, and the efficient governance of an empire spanning 3 continents. At the center of this cultural flowering stood Persepolis, the ceremonial capital. Founded by Darius the Great and expanded by his successors, Persepolis was never a traditional city. It was designed as a symbolic space where the king received delegations, held ceremonies, and displayed imperial grandeur. Built on a massive stone terrace at the foot of the Zagros Mountains, Persepolis was a masterpiece of design and symbolism. Its grand audience halls, known as apodanas, were supported by towering columns decorated with capitals shaped like bulls, lions, and other animals. Reliefs carved into staircases and walls depicted a unified empire. Processions of dignitaries from distant lands brought tribute to the king, representing India, Babylon, Egypt, Lydia, and beyond, each in distinctive local dress and bearing regional gifts. The message was clear. The empire was vast, yet harmonious, governed by a benevolent monarch and united through diversity. The king stood at the center of a web of loyalties, customs, and exchanges, not above his subjects in isolation. Susa, another royal center, functioned as an administrative capital. Many royal decrees were issued from here and archives maintained. Its architecture combined Persian, Mesopotamian, and Elamite elements, emphasizing the cosmopolitan nature of the empire. Art and architecture under the Achaemenids were both symbolic and practical. Stone reliefs, glazed bricks, and gold-inlaid inscriptions celebrated the king's power and divine legitimacy. Royal tombs, such as those at Nakshi Rustam near Persepolis, were carved directly into cliffs, featuring inscriptions praising the king, his victories, and his right to rule. These inscriptions were written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform, 3 of the empire's major languages. This multilingual approach reflected inclusiveness in governance, using linguistic diversity to enhance communication and legitimacy. One of the most famous inscriptions is the Behistun inscription, carved into a cliff in western Iran by Darius the Great. It records his rise to power, suppression of revolts, and divine support from Ahura Mazda. It served as a declaration of lawful authority, intended to be seen and read by travelers and officials across the empire. The religious worldview underpinning. Imperial ideology was rooted in Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian faith emphasizing the struggle between truth, Asha, and falsehood. While not formally a state religion, Zoroastrian beliefs shape the language of kingship and ethics, guiding the moral and political order of the empire. The king chosen by Ahura Mazda bore the responsibility of maintaining order and justice throughout the empire. Religious tolerance was a hallmark of Achaemenid policy. Rather than attempting to convert conquered peoples, the Persian kings often funded local temples, respected established priesthoods, and allowed subject populations to worship according to their own customs. This approach helped foster loyalty and reduce resistance. In Babylon, the kings supported the influential Marduk priesthood. In Egypt, they presented themselves as successors to the pharaohs, restoring temples neglected under previous regimes. One of the most famous examples of Persian tolerance is recorded in the so-called Cyrus cylinder, an inscription from the reign of Cyrus the Great found in Babylon. It declares Cyrus's commitment to restoring displaced peoples and their religious sanctuaries. Though not a charter of human rights in the modern sense, it reflects the Persian principle of ruling through respect and restoration rather than destruction. This principle extended to law and administration. While the empire maintained centralized authority under the king, local laws and customs were often preserved. Satraps, the provincial governors, were expected to collect taxes and maintain order, but usually allowed local councils and courts to function according to tradition. This dual structure enabled governance of diverse populations without constant repression. Economically, the empire benefited from an extensive network of trade routes spanning from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. The Royal Road, stretching over 1,500 miles from Susa to Sardis, was patrolled and maintained to facilitate communication, trade, and troop movements. Caravans carried textiles, spices, metals, and ceramics across vast distances. The introduction of standardized coinage, particularly the gold daric, further integrated regional economies. The empire's scale required sophisticated record-keeping and logistics. Clay tablets from Persepolis, written in Elamite, detail labor assignments, rations, and supply chains. These records show that Achaemenid administration was methodical, capable of tracking resources, managing personnel, and coordinating large projects across distant territories. This emphasis on structure and order extended to court ceremony. The Persian king was a semi-divine figure, rarely seen by ordinary subjects. Access to the royal presence was strictly controlled, and elaborate protocols governed how officials approached and addressed the monarch. These rituals reinforced the majesty and authority of the king while maintaining the appearance of cosmic order. Yet for all its grandeur, the Achaemenid court fostered cultural exchange rare for its time. Greek physicians, Phoenician artisans, Lydian architects, and Babylonian scribes all served in various capacities. The empire functioned not as a monoculture, but as a dynamic system integrating and elevating contributions from many civilizations. Persian culture also spread outward. In Anatolia, artistic motifs and administrative practices reflected Persian influence. In Egypt, Persian inscriptions appeared alongside traditional hieroglyphs. Even in Greece, where resistance to Persian power had been fierce, elements of Persian art, fashion, and organization became fashionable among elites. By the early 4th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire represented one of the most successful multicultural states in ancient history. It combined military strength with administrative innovation, religious tolerance, and artistic expression. Its legacy shaped not only the lands it ruled, but also the empires that followed. Yet the stability enabling this cultural peak was not immune to the pressures of time. Behind the ceremonial splendor of Persepolis and the efficient bureaucracy of Susa, tensions were rising, economic strains, ambitious satraps, and rival claims to the throne. By the early 4th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire still stretched from the shores of the Aegean to the valleys of the Indus. Its governance systems remained intact, and its kings continued to rule from Susa and Persepolis. But beneath the surface, the empire was weakening. Internal divisions, rising satrapal autonomy, court intrigues, and economic strains eroded the foundations laid by Darius the Great and his successors. This period of slow decline might have continued for generations if not for the emergence of an extraordinary figure to the west, Alexander, son of Philip II of Macedon. Philip had unified the Greek city-states under Macedonian hegemony and laid the groundwork for a campaign against Persia. But his assassination passed that ambition to his 20-year-old son. Young though he was, Alexander inherited not only his father's military machine but also his vision of expansion. With a disciplined army, political support from the Greek League, and limitless personal ambition, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor in the spring of 334 BCE. The Persian king at the time was Darius III, who had ascended the throne after internal strife and assassination. His authority was weak, and many satraps acted independently. Although Darius commanded the resources of a vast empire, he struggled to unify it against the fast-moving, tactically brilliant Macedonian king. Alexander's first major confrontation with Persian forces occurred at the Battle of the Granicus River. The Persian army, commanded by local satraps, attempted to block his advance. Despite superior numbers, Persian cavalry failed to dislodge Alexander's forces, and the Macedonians secured a clear victory. This battle opened the way for Alexander to move through western Anatolia, capturing key cities and gaining support from local Greek communities resenting Persian oversight. He then marched south, securing coastal cities and neutralizing Persian naval bases. One of the most dramatic episodes was the siege of Tyre. The island city resisted for months, but Alexander built a causeway to reach its walls and stormed the city. Though costly, the siege eliminated a major Persian naval stronghold and showcased Alexander's determination to subdue resistance. In 333 BCE, Alexander faced Darius III directly at the Battle of Issus in southern Turkey. Darius had assembled a massive army, expecting a decisive victory. However, Alexander's tactical skill and personal leadership turned the tide. The Macedonian flanks held firm while Alexander led a direct charge at Darius's position. In the chaos, Darius fled, leaving his family and royal treasures behind. The psychological impact was immense. The aura of Persian invincibility shattered, and many subjects doubted their king's ability to protect them. Following Issus, Alexander continued south into Egypt, welcomed as a liberator, consolidating his power. At the Nile's mouth, he founded Alexandria, which would become one of the greatest urban centers of the ancient world. He also visited the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis, where he may have been declared a son of a god, reinforcing his sense of divine destiny. Meanwhile, Darius attempted to regroup, offering peace terms including Western territories and a vast ransom. Alexander rejected them, insisting he alone was the rightful king of Asia. Determined, he marched into the heart of the Persian Empire. The final confrontation came in 331 BCE at the Battle of Gaugamela, near present-day Mosul, Iraq. Darius had assembled a massive army from all corners of the empire, including infantry, cavalry, war elephants, and scythed chariots. The battlefield was prepared to favor Persian chariots and cavalry. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Alexander executed brilliant tactics, drawing Persian forces outward with feigned retreats and exploiting gaps with precision attacks. Once again, Darius fled, and his army dissolved into confusion. With the road to Mesopotamia open, Alexander entered Babylon, greeted as king, then moved to Susa, and finally Persepolis, the symbolic heart of the Achaemenid Empire. The city, with its palaces, treasuries, and ceremonial halls, represented the culmination of Persian imperial achievement. Yet in a symbolic act, Alexander allowed his troops to loot Persepolis, and according to some sources, permitted the burning of its grand palace. Accounts differ on whether the fire was accidental or intentional, possibly revenge for Persia's earlier destruction of Athens. The burning of Persepolis marked the symbolic end of the Achaemenid dynasty. Though Darius III was still alive, he had fled east to raise a new army. His power broken, his own satraps began abandoning him. In a final act of betrayal, Darius was captured and murdered by his commander Bessus, satrap of Bactria. Alexander, upon discovering Darius's body, expressed anger at the murder and gave the fallen king a royal funeral. He then pursued Bessus into Central Asia, capturing and executing him to consolidate control over the remaining eastern provinces. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire did not end Persian culture or influence. In many ways, Alexander adopted the empire's legacy. He maintained much of its administration, wore Persian clothing, married into Persian nobility, and appointed Persian satraps and officials. His aim was not to destroy Persia, but to rule it as its new king, blending Macedonian and Persian traditions in a unified empire. Yet the loss of the Achaemenid dynasty was profound. It marked the end of a 2-century-old imperial system that had governed with tolerance, administrative efficiency, and cultural sophistication. The empire that began with Cyrus the Great expanded under Darius and reached its artistic peak in Persepolis, fell to a single ambitious conqueror. With the death of Darius III and Alexander's conquest, the Achaemenid Empire ended. Though its imperial structure collapsed, the Persian world did not vanish. Instead, it entered a new phase under foreign rule. Beginning with the Seleucid Empire, a Hellenistic state attempting to fuse Greek and Persian traditions while navigating the tensions between them. Following Alexander's untimely death in Babylon in 323 BCE, his empire fractured. With no clear successor, his generals, known as the Diadochi, competed for control, dividing the empire into rival kingdoms. After years of conflict, former cavalry commander Seleucus emerged as ruler over the eastern provinces, including most former Persian heartlands. Seleucus established the Seleucid Empire, which at its height stretched from western Anatolia to India. Though Macedonian in origin, one of Seleucus's first challenges was legitimizing his authority in a land that had been ruled for centuries by native dynasties. Rather than attempting to replace local customs outright, the Seleucids adopted many elements of Persian governance. They maintained the satrapal system of provincial administration and allowed many Persian elites to retain their positions, provided they pledged loyalty to the new regime. Temples continued to receive patronage, and local religions were largely tolerated. However, the Seleucids also promoted Greek language, art, and urban planning. They founded numerous cities, often naming them after themselves or members of Alexander's entourage: Antioch, Seleucia, Apamea. These cities were built with grid patterns, agoras, marketplaces, gymnasiums, and theatres, serving as administrative centres and cultural hubs for the Hellenistic elite. Greek settlers were encouraged to move into these cities, and over time, a Greek-speaking urban class emerged in parts of Iran. The most prominent of these cities was Seleucia on the Tigris. Founded near the ruins of Babylon, it became the new capital of the eastern Seleucid world and rivaled other great cities in trade, population, and influence. The city reflected the ambitions of the Seleucid kings to create a state that balanced Greek rationalism with the grandeur of the Persian past. Despite these efforts at integration, the Seleucid Empire faced persistent challenges in governing its eastern territories. The empire was vast, and the further one moved from the Mediterranean core, the more tenuous Seleucid authority became. In the Iranian plateau and Central Asia, satraps and local dynasts exercised significant autonomy. These regions retained deep-rooted Persian traditions that resisted full Hellenization. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian faith, continued to flourish despite the prominence of Greek religion among the ruling elite. Fire temples remained active, and Zoroastrian priests maintained their role in rural and tribal communities. While the Seleucid kings often supported local cults for political reasons, they never embraced Zoroastrianism as an imperial religion, creating a cultural gap between rulers and many of their subjects. Additionally, the Seleucid military depended heavily on Greek and Macedonian troops, many unfamiliar with the terrain and customs of Iran. The distance from the imperial center in Syria to the eastern provinces made communication and response to revolts slow and difficult. This situation created opportunities for local powers to reassert themselves. One such challenge came from the Iranian steppe to the northeast. A tribe known as the Pani, part of the larger Dahai Confederation, began exerting pressure on the Seleucid eastern frontiers. These nomadic horsemen, skilled in archery and cavalry tactics, would soon give rise to a new Iranian power, the Parthians. Their emergence marked the beginning of the end for Seleucid control over Persia. In addition to military threats, the Seleucid Empire was plagued by dynastic disputes and succession crises. The descendants of Seleucus often fought among themselves for control of the throne, leading to internal instability. These rivalries weakened central authority and made the provinces harder to govern. Moreover, the Seleucids were constantly entangled in wars with other Hellenistic kingdoms such as the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Antigonids in Macedon. These conflicts diverted resources and attention away from the eastern territories where unrest simmered. Despite these pressures, the Seleucid period left a lasting cultural impact. Hellenistic art, philosophy, and science found their way into Persian cities. At the same time, Persian motifs and religious ideas influenced Greek settlers. In some areas, coinage featured both Greek and local symbols. Bilingual inscriptions became common, and artistic styles blended classical and Eastern elements. One notable example of this fusion is found in the development of Greco-Buddhism in regions such as Bactria and Gandhara, where Greek artistic techniques were applied to Indian religious imagery. Although geographically on the empire's edge, these regions highlight the complex cultural interactions sparked by Seleucid rule. By the mid-3rd century BCE, however, the empire's weaknesses had become more apparent. Local revolts grew more frequent, and the central government was increasingly unable to project its power. The rise of Rome in the west and renewed threats from nomadic peoples in the east placed further strain on the empire's resources. In the eastern Iranian world, a decisive blow came when Arsaces, leader of the Pani tribe, seized control of Parthia, a former satrapy in northeastern Iran. Around the year 247 BCE, Arsaces declared independence from the Seleucid Empire and established the Arsacid dynasty, which would eventually form the Parthian Empire. Although initially limited in scope, this rebellion marked the beginning of a new Iranian resurgence. The Seleucids attempted to retake the lost territory, but their efforts were inconsistent and ultimately unsuccessful. Over the next several decades, Parthia expanded, taking advantage of Seleucid weakness and gaining support from local populations who saw the Arsacids as a return to native rule. By the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, Seleucid control over Iran was collapsing. The empire that had tried to combine the legacies of Greece and Persia was retreating westward, while a new power rooted in Iranian tradition was on the rise. As the Seleucid Empire weakened under internal strife and external pressures, the Iranian plateau witnessed the reawakening of native power. From the northeastern frontier, a new dynasty arose, one that would restore Persian sovereignty, challenge imperial norms, and carve out an enduring place in Iranian history. This was the rise of the Parthians, also known as the Arsacid dynasty, named after their founding leader. Arsaces, the Parthians, were originally part of the Dahai, a confederation of nomadic tribes living along the northeastern edge of the Iranian world near the Central Asian steppes. Among these tribes, the Pani stood out for their military prowess and organizational discipline. Skilled in mounted archery and steppe warfare, they blended nomadic traditions with the political ambitions of a settled empire. The turning point came in the mid-3rd century BCE when Arsaces led his people into the region of Parthia, a Seleucid satrapy in northeastern Iran. Around 247 BC, he seized control of the region, capitalizing on Seleucid instability and local dissatisfaction. He established a base at Nisa, a city that would serve as one of the early capitals of the new Parthian state. Though modest at first, the Arsacid revolt represented more than a provincial rebellion. It symbolized the reassertion of Iranian identity after decades of foreign rule. The Parthians quickly adopted many aspects of Persian kingship, including the use of Zoroastrian symbolism and the Old Persian title, King of Kings, yet they did so in a way reflecting their unique origins and geopolitical realities. Arsaces was succeeded by his brother Tiridates, and over the following generations, the Arsacids consolidated their rule over Parthia and expanded westward. Their legitimacy was strengthened by local support and the steady retreat of Seleucid influence from the Iranian plateau. The true architect of Parthian power, however, was Mithridates the Fair, who ascended in the early 2nd century BCE. Under his rule, the Parthians transformed from a regional force into a true empire. Mithridates launched campaigns extending Parthian control into Media, Babylonia, and Elam. His victories brought the heartland of Persia back under Iranian rule for the first time since the fall of the Achaemenids. One of Mithridates' key strategies was incorporating diverse peoples into his administration. While emphasizing Iranian traditions, he also adopted elements of Hellenistic governance where useful. Greek remained a language of administration and diplomacy, especially in former Seleucid cities. Yet Mithridates increasingly emphasized Iranian culture, language, and Zoroastrian values in his royal image. Coinage from his reign shows this duality clearly. Early Parthian coins bore Greek inscriptions and portrayed the king in Hellenistic style. Later issues shifted toward distinctly Iranian iconography, reflecting the growing confidence of the new regime. As the Parthians expanded, they encountered both opportunity and resistance. In Mesopotamia, they faced remnants of Seleucid authority and independent city-states. In the west, they came into contact with the rising power of Rome, which was expanding eastward after victories in the Mediterranean. The collision between these two powers would shape much of Parthian foreign policy for centuries. The Parthian military system was built around cavalry. Unlike the heavy infantry of the Greeks or the legions of Rome, Parthian armies relied on mobility, endurance, and precision. The most feared unit was the cataphract, heavily armored horsemen delivering devastating charges. Supporting them were mounted archers whose hit-and-run tactics made Parthian armies difficult to engage in conventional battle. This approach was showcased in one of the era's most famous confrontations, the Battle of Carrhae. In 53 BCE, a Roman army under Marcus Licinius Crassus invaded Parthian territory seeking glory and wealth. The Parthians, led by General Surena, lured the Romans into the desert and decimated them with superior tactics and cavalry maneuvers. The defeat was humiliating for Rome. Crassus was killed, and thousands of Roman soldiers were slain or captured. The victory at Carrhae established Parthia as a formidable power in the eastern Mediterranean and served as a warning that the East could not be conquered easily. Politically, the Parthian Empire developed a distinctive model of rule. Unlike the centralized bureaucracies of the Achaemenids or Seleucids, the Arsacids maintained a loose confederation of semi-autonomous kingdoms and noble families. Local dynasts, particularly in regions such as Armenia and Media, were allowed considerable independence as long as they acknowledged Parthian supremacy and contributed military support. This feudal structure gave the empire flexibility but also made it vulnerable to internal divisions. Succession disputes were common, and rival claimants often relied on powerful noble families to back their bids for the throne. The Arsacid kings had to constantly negotiate, reward loyalty, and assert authority in a political landscape where allegiance was always shifting. Culturally, the Parthians cultivated a revival of Iranian traditions. They patronized Zoroastrian temples and supported the priestly class. though the religion remained diverse and decentralized. Fire temples reappeared across the Iranian plateau, and sacred texts were preserved orally and in writing. At the same time, the Parthians absorbed influences from their diverse subjects, creating a rich hybrid culture that included Hellenistic, Babylonian, Armenian, and even Indian elements. The Parthians also developed a royal ideology emphasizing continuity with the past. They presented themselves as heirs to both the Achaemenids and the spiritual traditions of ancient Iran. Royal titles emphasized legitimacy, divine favor, and protection of Asha, order against chaos, core principles of Zoroastrian belief. Over the course of the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the Parthian Empire became one of the dominant powers of the ancient world. Its rivalry with Rome defined Near Eastern politics, while internal stability allowed flourishing trade along the Silk Road. Goods from China, India, and Central Asia passed through Parthian territory en route to the Mediterranean, bringing wealth and fostering cultural exchange. Despite their decentralized system, the Parthians maintained control over their vast realm for nearly 5 centuries. They succeeded where the Seleucids had failed by forging a durable Iranian state combining native traditions with imperial governance. However, their model also had limits. The same noble families that made the empire flexible could also challenge royal authority. The lack of a standardized bureaucracy made central control difficult. As new challenges emerged both from within and beyond the borders, the Parthians would eventually face the need for reform and renewal. As the Parthian Empire expanded across the Iranian plateau and into Mesopotamia, it came face to face with a rising power from the west, Rome. What followed was a centuries-long rivalry between two of the ancient world's greatest empires, a geopolitical struggle defined by war, diplomacy, and cultural interaction. This confrontation not only shaped the fate of the Near East, but also tested the resilience and adaptability of the Parthian state. Rome's emergence as a regional superpower had accelerated following its conquests in the Western Mediterranean, particularly after the defeat of Carthage in the Punic Wars. By the 2nd century BCE, Roman interests had moved eastward, bringing the Republic and later the Empire into direct contact with Hellenistic and Eastern kingdoms. The absorption of territories once ruled by the Seleucids brought Rome closer to the Euphrates River, the traditional frontier of Mesopotamia and, by extension, Parthian territory. The first major clash occurred in the mid-1st century BCE in an effort to secure Rome's eastern border and gain personal military glory. Marcus Licinius Crassus, a member of the powerful First Triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey, launched an invasion of Parthian lands. The campaign ended in disaster at the Battle of Carrhae, where Crassus was killed and his army nearly annihilated by the Parthian general Surena. Parthian tactics centered on highly mobile cavalry and mounted archers proved devastating against the slower Roman legions. This victory had both immediate and long-term consequences. It was a humiliating blow to Roman prestige and established Parthia as a serious rival. It also introduced the Roman world to the effectiveness of Eastern cavalry warfare, influencing military strategies in future encounters. Following this, Rome and Parthia entered a prolonged period of alternating hostility and negotiation. Neither side was able to decisively conquer the other's core territories, but both sought to assert dominance over the buffer zones that lay between them, particularly Armenia. This mountainous kingdom, located between the Roman and Parthian spheres of influence, became a focal point of diplomatic and military maneuvering. The Armenians themselves were often caught in the middle, sometimes favoring Rome, at other times allying with Parthia. Both empires attempted to install friendly kings on the Armenian throne, and the kingdom frequently changed hands as the balance of power shifted. These proxy struggles reflected the broader pattern of Roman-Parthian rivalry. Direct conflict was costly and inconclusive, but influence could be gained through client kings and shifting alliances. One of the most dramatic episodes of this ongoing contest occurred during the reign of the Roman Emperor Augustus. Following a period of civil war in Rome and the fall of the Republic, Augustus established the Principate and sought to stabilize the empire's borders. In the east, this included negotiating a settlement with Parthia. Rather than engaging in another full-scale war, Augustus used diplomacy. He secured the return of the Roman standards lost at Carrhae, symbols of honor and military pride, through negotiation rather than battle. The agreement, while limited in scope, allowed both sides to claim success and averted further bloodshed for a time. Still, tensions remained. The 1st century CE saw periodic flare-ups, including Roman campaigns into Armenia and Parthian incursions into Roman Syria. The Parthians maintained their traditional military style, relying on swift cavalry and decentralized command, while the Romans relied on heavily fortified frontier cities and disciplined infantry formations. The geographical nature of the Near East, with its deserts, rivers, and mountain ranges, often favored the defensive over the offensive, preventing either side from achieving lasting conquests. Despite these military stalemates, the interactions between Rome and Parthia went beyond warfare. Trade between the two empires flourished, particularly along the Silk Road. Parthia served as a key intermediary between Rome and the civilizations of Central Asia, India, and China. Luxury goods such as silk, spices, pearls, and fine textiles passed through Parthian hands en route to Roman markets, while Roman glassware, silver, and artwork made their way eastward. This trade was not just economic, it also fostered cultural exchange. Roman coins, inscriptions, and goods have been found deep in Parthian territory. At the same time, Eastern motifs began appearing in Roman art and architecture. Parthian dress and style, including trousers and soft boots, even influenced Roman fashion in the eastern provinces. Meanwhile, the Parthian court cultivated its own identity. Distinct from both Achaemenid and Hellenistic models, the Arsacid kings emphasized their Iranian heritage while adopting certain Hellenistic practices where useful. They issued coins bearing their portraits, often with inscriptions in Greek, but depicted themselves in traditional Parthian garb with tiaras and long beards. Their rule blended tribal leadership with royal ceremony, and they continued to rely on the support of powerful noble families who held substantial local authority. One of Mithridates' key strategies was incorporating diverse peoples into his administration. While emphasizing Iranian traditions, he also adopted elements of Hellenistic governance where useful. Greek remained a language of administration and diplomacy, especially in former Seleucid cities. Yet Mithridates increasingly emphasized Iranian culture, language, and Zoroastrian values in his royal image. Coinage from his reign shows this duality clearly. Early Parthian coins bore Greek inscriptions and portrayed the king in Hellenistic style. Later issues shifted toward distinctly Iranian iconography, reflecting the growing confidence of the new regime. As the Parthians expanded, they encountered both opportunity and resistance. In Mesopotamia, they faced remnants of Seleucid authority and independent city-states. In the west, they came into contact with the rising power of Rome, which was expanding eastward after victories in the Mediterranean. The collision between these two powers would shape much of Parthian foreign policy for centuries. The Parthian military system was built around cavalry. Unlike the heavy infantry of the Greeks or the legions of Rome, Parthian armies relied on mobility, endurance, and precision. The most feared unit was the cataphract, heavily armored horsemen delivering devastating charges. Supporting them were mounted archers whose hit-and-run tactics made Parthian armies difficult to engage in conventional battle. This approach was showcased in one of the era's most famous confrontations, the Battle of Carrhae. In 53 BCE, a Roman army under Marcus Licinius Crassus invaded Parthian territory seeking glory and wealth. The Parthians, led by General Surena, lured the Romans into the desert and decimated them with superior tactics and cavalry maneuvers. The defeat was humiliating for Rome, Crassus was killed, and thousands of Roman soldiers were slain or captured. The victory at Carrhae established Parthia as a formidable power in the eastern Mediterranean and served as a warning that the East could not be conquered easily. Politically, the Parthian Empire developed a distinctive model of rule. Unlike the centralized bureaucracies of the Achaemenids or Seleucids, the Arsacids maintained a loose confederation of semi-autonomous kingdoms and noble families. Local dynasts, particularly in regions such as Armenia and Media, were allowed considerable independence as long as they acknowledged Parthian supremacy and contributed military support. This feudal structure gave the empire flexibility but also made it vulnerable to internal divisions. Succession disputes were common, and rival claimants often relied on powerful noble families to back their bids for the throne. The Arsacid kings had to constantly negotiate, reward loyalty, and assert authority in a political landscape where allegiance was always shifting. Culturally, the Parthians cultivated a revival of Iranian traditions. They patronized Zoroastrian temples and supported the priestly class, though the religion remained diverse and decentralized. Fire temples reappeared across the Iranian plateau, and sacred texts were preserved orally and in writing. At the same time, the Parthians absorbed influences from their diverse subjects, creating a rich hybrid culture that included Hellenistic, Babylonian, Armenian, and even Indian elements. The Parthians also developed a royal ideology emphasizing continuity with the past. They presented themselves as heirs to both the Achaemenids and the spiritual traditions of ancient Iran. Royal titles emphasized legitimacy, divine favor, and protection of Asher order against chaos, core principles of Zoroastrian belief. Over the course of the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the Parthian Empire became one of the dominant powers of the ancient world. Its rivalry with Rome defined Near Eastern politics, while internal stability allowed flourishing trade along the Silk Road. Goods from China, India, and Central Asia passed through Parthian territory en route to the Mediterranean, bringing wealth and fostering cultural exchange. Despite their decentralized system, the Parthians maintained control over their vast realm for nearly 5 centuries. They succeeded where the Seleucids had failed by forging a durable Iranian state combining native traditions with imperial governance. However, their model also had limits. The same noble families that made the empire flexible could also challenge royal authority. The lack of a standardized bureaucracy made central control difficult. As new challenges emerged both from within and beyond the borders, the Parthians would eventually face the need for reform and renewal. As the Parthian Empire expanded across the Iranian plateau and into Mesopotamia, it came face to face with a rising power from the west, Rome. What followed was a centuries-long rivalry between two of the ancient world's greatest empires, a geopolitical struggle defined by war, diplomacy, and cultural interaction. This confrontation not only shaped the fate of the Near East, but also tested the resilience and adaptability of the Parthian state. Rome's emergence as a regional superpower had accelerated following its conquests in the Western Mediterranean, particularly after the defeat of Carthage in the Punic Wars. By the 2nd century BCE, Roman interests had moved eastward, bringing the Republic and later the Empire into direct contact with Hellenistic and Eastern kingdoms. The absorption of territories once ruled by the Seleucids brought Rome closer to the Euphrates River, the traditional frontier of Mesopotamia and, by extension, Parthian territory. The first major clash occurred in the mid-1st century BCE in an effort to secure Rome's eastern border and gain personal military glory. Marcus Licinius Crassus, a member of the powerful First Triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey, launched an invasion of Parthian lands. The campaign ended in disaster at the Battle of Carrhae, where Crassus was killed and his army nearly annihilated by the Parthian general Surena. Parthian tactics centered on highly mobile cavalry and mounted archers proved devastating against the slower Roman legions. This victory had both immediate and long-term consequences. It was a humiliating blow to Roman prestige and established Parthia as a serious rival. It also introduced the Roman world to the effectiveness of Eastern cavalry warfare, influencing military strategies in future encounters. Following this, Rome and Parthia entered a prolonged period of alternating hostility and negotiation. Neither side was able to decisively conquer the other's core territories, but both sought to assert dominance over the buffer zones that lay between them, particularly Armenia. This mountainous kingdom, located between the Roman and Parthian spheres of influence, became a focal point of diplomatic and military maneuvering. The Armenians themselves were often caught in the middle, sometimes favoring Rome, at other times allying with Parthia. Both empires attempted to install friendly kings on the Armenian throne, and the kingdom frequently changed hands as the balance of power shifted. These proxy struggles reflected the broader pattern of Roman-Parthian rivalry. Direct conflict was costly and inconclusive, but influence could be gained through client kings and shifting alliances. One of the most dramatic episodes of this ongoing contest occurred during the reign of the Roman Emperor Augustus. Following a period of civil war in Rome and the fall of the Republic, Augustus established the Principate and sought to stabilize the empire's borders. In the east, this included negotiating a settlement with Parthia. Rather than engaging in another full-scale war, Augustus used diplomacy. He secured the return of the Roman standards lost at Carrhae, symbols of honor and military pride, through negotiation rather than battle. The agreement, while limited in scope, allowed both sides to claim success and averted further bloodshed for a time. Still, tensions remained. The 1st century CE saw periodic flare-ups, including Roman campaigns into Armenia and Parthian incursions into Roman Syria. The Parthians maintained their traditional military style, relying on swift cavalry and decentralized command, while the Romans relied on heavily fortified frontier cities and disciplined infantry formations. The geographical nature of the Near East, with its deserts, rivers, and mountain ranges, often favored the defensive over the offensive, preventing either side from achieving lasting conquests. Despite these military stalemates, the interactions between Rome and Parthia went beyond warfare. Trade between the two empires flourished, particularly along the Silk Road. Parthia served as a key intermediary between Rome and the civilizations of Central Asia, India, and China. Luxury goods such as silk, spices, pearls, and fine textiles passed through Parthian hands en route to Roman markets, while Roman glassware, silver, and artwork made their way eastward. This trade was not just economic, it also fostered cultural exchange. Roman coins, inscriptions, and goods have been found deep in Parthian territory. At the same time, Eastern motifs began appearing in Roman art and architecture. Parthian dress and style, including trousers and soft boots, even influenced Roman fashion in the eastern provinces. Meanwhile, the Parthian court cultivated its own identity. Distinct from both Achaemenid and Hellenistic models, the Arsacid kings emphasized their Iranian heritage while adopting certain Hellenistic practices where useful. They issued coins bearing their portraits, often with inscriptions in Greek, but depicted themselves in traditional Parthian garb with tiaras and long beards. Their rule blended tribal leadership with royal ceremony, and they continued to rely on the support of powerful noble families who held substantial local authority. One of the recurring challenges for the Parthians was maintaining cohesion within this loosely structured empire. While their flexible approach allowed for local autonomy and cultural diversity, it also made it difficult to coordinate large-scale reforms or centralized administration. Rebellions among satraps, disputes over succession, and rivalries between noble clans frequently destabilized the court. Despite these issues, the Parthians endured. They remained a powerful counterweight to Rome in the east and preserved an Iranian imperial tradition that had survived Alexander's conquests and the Seleucid interlude. The Arsacids styled themselves as heirs to Cyrus and Darius, and their survival against one of history's most powerful empires reinforced their legitimacy. The rivalry between Parthia and Rome continued into the 2nd century. Under the Roman emperors, Trajan and Hadrian, the balance briefly shifted. Trajan launched a full-scale invasion of Parthian territory and even captured the cities of Seleucia and Ctesiphon. He declared Mesopotamia a Roman province, but his gains were short-lived. After his death, Hadrian reversed the expansion and withdrew Roman forces, recognizing the difficulty of holding territory so far from the imperial center. The back-and-forth nature of Roman-Parthian relations persisted for another century. Each side claimed victories and suffered setbacks, but neither was able to deliver a decisive blow. This equilibrium eventually gave way to new tensions, not just between Rome and Parthia, but within Parthia itself. By the late 2nd century CE, the Arsacid dynasty was in decline. Internal divisions grew more severe, and central authority weakened. Noble families acted increasingly independently, and conflicts over succession became more frequent and disruptive. This disintegration opened the door to new challenges from both Rome and internal reformers. By the close of the 2nd century CE, the Parthian Empire, once a formidable rival to Rome and a proud heir to Persian sovereignty, was showing deep signs of strain. While its military had held off Roman incursions and its economy continued to benefit from Silk Road trade, internal instability was eroding the empire's foundations. The same decentralized model that had once allowed the Arsacids to govern a vast and culturally diverse territory now left it. Vulnerable to fragmentation, at the core of this vulnerability was the structure of Parthian rule itself. The Arsacid monarchs operated a confederation of semi-autonomous noble houses. These aristocratic families, while loyal in name to the central king, often exercised independent control over their own regions, commanding local armies, collecting taxes, and administering justice. The king had to constantly negotiate with these families to maintain power, often by granting privileges or arranging strategic marriages. This balance worked for generations, especially during times of external threat when unity was essential. However, in periods of peace or weak leadership, the centrifugal forces of the nobility grew stronger. Succession disputes became increasingly common as rival branches of the Arsacid family and their noble backers vied for control of the throne. By the early 3rd century CE, the situation had deteriorated into a series of open conflicts. Different claimants to the throne emerged across the empire, each backed by powerful regional elites. This period of civil strife severely weakened the ability of the central government to function effectively, as resources were diverted toward internal battles. The administration of provinces faltered, trade was disrupted, and the military became divided in its loyalties. The weakening of the Arsacid court also led to religious uncertainty. Zoroastrianism remained a widespread and deeply rooted faith, but it lacked a centralized structure. Fire temples varied in practice, and no single priestly authority unified doctrine or ritual. In this environment, alternative religious movements gained ground. Among these was the dualist religion of Manichaeism, founded by the prophet Mani, which synthesized elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism. In such a fragmented context, new voices began calling for reform and renewal, not just of leadership, but of the Persian imperial idea itself. One of the most significant of these figures was Ardashir, a local ruler from the province of Persis, known in earlier times as the heartland of Achaemenid Persia. Ardashir was the son of Pabag, a priestly official or local noble who had gained influence in southwestern Iran. The family claimed descent from the ancient kings of Persia and had maintained strong ties to Zoroastrian institutions. Unlike many other Parthian nobles, Ardashir did not simply seek power within the existing system. He aimed to replace it entirely. Ardashir's rise began with a campaign to assert control over neighboring territories. He expanded his power steadily, defeating other regional leaders and challenging Parthian authority directly. His military success was matched by his appeal to a shared Persian identity rooted in Zoroastrian ethics and the memory of the Achaemenid past. The decisive moment came in the year 24 CE at the Battle of Hormozgan. Ardashir confronted Artabanus Thorthor, one of the last Parthian kings, in a direct contest for the crown. Ardashir's forces prevailed and Artabanus was killed in battle. With this victory, Ardashir declared the end of the Arsacid dynasty and the beginning of a new imperial order, the Sasanian Empire. The name Sasanian derives from Ardashir's claimed ancestor, Sasan, a figure associated with Zoroastrian religious authority. This link was not accidental. The early Sasanian state was deeply tied to religious legitimacy, promoting Zoroastrianism not merely as a personal faith, but as a state ideology. Ardashir positioned himself as the chosen of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrian belief, and as the restorer of Persian glory. This restoration went beyond religious symbolism. Ardashir sought to revive and centralize imperial structures that had eroded under the Parthians. He reasserted royal control over the provinces, diminished the autonomy of noble families, and created a more hierarchical administrative system. The Sasanian court, unlike the Parthian one, was modeled on a strong monarchic center with clearly defined bureaucratic and military ranks. The fall of the Parthians and the rise of the Sasanians thus represented more than a dynastic change. It marked a reassertion of central authority, a revival of Persian imperial tradition, and a cultural shift that would define Iran for centuries to come. The Sasanians adopted many symbols of the Achaemenid royal tradition, titles such as King of Kings, iconography drawn from ancient carvings, and an emphasis on law and order inspired by Zoroastrian values. The transition also marked a turning point in foreign policy. While the Parthians had generally taken a reactive stance toward Rome, the Sasanians pursued a more assertive posture. They viewed themselves not as the heirs of a crumbling Eastern Empire, but as equal rivals to Rome and guardians of a divine civilizational order. The stage was set for renewed conflict, one that would reshape the balance of power in the Near East. Yet, the legacy of the Parthians should not be overshadowed by their fall. For nearly 5 centuries, the Arsacid dynasty had preserved Iranian sovereignty, protected Zoroastrian culture, and maintained a balance of power with Rome. Their decentralized model, while ultimately unsustainable in the face of new challenges, had allowed for remarkable resilience and cultural synthesis. The rise of the Sasanian Empire in the early 3rd century CE marked a new chapter in the history of Persia. After centuries of decentralized rule under the Parthians, the Sasanian dynasty established a strong centralized state that sought to revive the glory of ancient Persia and elevate Zoroastrianism as a unifying state religion. Their rule would last for over 4 centuries and represent one of the most culturally vibrant and politically ambitious periods in Iranian history. Ardashir I, the founder of the Sasanian dynasty, wasted no time in asserting his authority after his victory over Artabanus IV. His early reign was marked by a series of military campaigns aimed at consolidating control over the Iranian plateau. He moved swiftly to bring rebellious provinces into line, subdued semi-independent noble families, and asserted royal authority over territories that had previously operated with considerable autonomy under Parthian rule. The reassertion of centralized control was not simply political, it was also ideological. Ardashir framed his kingship as a sacred duty ordained by Ahura Mazda, the chief deity in Zoroastrianism. In contrast to the more pragmatic religious tolerance of the Parthians, the Sasanian rulers promoted Zoroastrianism as a state religion. This involved standardizing religious doctrine, codifying sacred texts, and elevating the priesthood to a prominent position within the state. Zoroastrian temples were built or restored throughout the empire, and fire, considered a symbol of purity and divine truth, became the central element of ritual practice. The high priest, or mobed, held a status second only to the king himself, and religious institutions were closely linked with state administration. This close alignment between throne and altar helped legitimize Sasanian rule and create a cohesive cultural identity across a diverse empire. Ardashir's successor, Shapur I, inherited a more unified realm and built upon this foundation with extraordinary ambition. Shapur continued the centralization process and expanded Sasanian influence beyond the Iranian plateau. He launched successful campaigns in the east, extending the empire's reach into Central Asia, and turned westward to confront Rome, which remained a persistent rival. The military conflict between the Sasanians and the Roman Empire became one of the defining features of the period. Shapur I scored a significant victory over the Romans in the mid-3rd century CE, capturing the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle, an event that shocked the Roman world. According to Sasanian sources, Valerian was taken prisoner and later used in forced labor projects, though Roman historians disputed some of these claims. Shapur immortalized his victory in monumental rock reliefs at Naksh-e-Rustam and Bishapur, where he is shown triumphing over Roman emperors. These carvings, like those of the Achaemenids before him, served as public declarations of imperial power and divine favor. They also reflected the Sasanian commitment to shaping history through visual and symbolic means. Under Shapur, the Sasanians also demonstrated a remarkable openness to religious and philosophical dialogue. Despite their endorsement of Zoroastrianism as the state faith, Shapur invited scholars and religious leaders of various backgrounds to his court. One of the most notable figures of this period was Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, a syncretic religion that blended elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism. Mani enjoyed temporary favor at court and even traveled with Shapur's armies, spreading his teachings. His emphasis on dualism, cosmic struggle, and spiritual liberation resonated with many but ultimately clashed with the growing orthodoxy of the Zoroastrian clergy. Later, Sasanian rulers, particularly Bahram Bausa, would persecute Manichaeans and other religious minorities in an effort to reinforce doctrinal unity. Despite these tensions, the early Sasanian period was marked by cultural vitality. The dynasty invested heavily in monumental architecture, court literature, and artistic production. Palaces with intricate stucco decorations, vaulted halls, and domed ceilings rose across the empire. Rock reliefs depicted scenes of royal investiture, hunting, and divine sanction, blending artistic sophistication with political messaging. The Sasanians also revived and preserved aspects of Iranian historical memory. Court historians and priests compiled chronicles that traced the lineage of Persian kings back to mythical and legendary ancestors. The idea of a continuous Persian monarchy stretching from the mythical Iranian kings through the Achaemenids to the Sasanians became a powerful narrative reinforcing both legitimacy and cultural pride. Economically, the Sasanian Empire benefited from its strategic location along key trade routes. It served as a central link between the Roman world in the west, the Indian subcontinent in the south, and the Silk Road networks that connected to China in the east. Sasanian merchants, craftsmen, and diplomats traveled widely, and goods from across the known world passed through Persian markets. The state supported infrastructure development, including road maintenance, bridge construction, and the establishment of caravanserais that accommodated travelers and merchants. These investments facilitated commerce and enabled more efficient movement of troops and officials. To manage its increasingly complex society, the Sasanian state developed a structured bureaucracy. Officials were appointed to oversee taxation, justice, and provincial governance. While the king remained the supreme authority, the imperial administration relied on a hierarchy of ministers, judges, and local governors to enforce royal directives. Written records, seals, and legal codes became more standardized, reflecting the state's desire for order and uniformity. Social structure under the Sasanians was highly stratified. Society was broadly divided into four main classes: priests, warriors, scribes, and farmers. This division, while not rigid, reflected a worldview in which each group had a designated role to play in maintaining cosmic and social balance. Nobility enjoyed privileges and often held land, while artisans and farmers supported the economy through labor and tribute. Women in Sasanian society, particularly among the nobility, could wield influence in family and court affairs, though their legal and public roles were generally limited compared to men. Marriage alliances between noble houses were an important means of securing political power and consolidating wealth. Throughout the 3rd and early 4th centuries CE, the Sasanians consolidated their achievements. They had restored a powerful Persian monarchy, centralized administration, revived Zoroastrianism, and built a thriving economy and cultural landscape. Their statecraft combined elements of ancient tradition with practical innovations suited to the complexities of late antiquity. Yet even as the Sasanian world flourished, new challenges began to emerge. Religious orthodoxy tightened, and dissenting views were increasingly suppressed. The growing power of the Zoroastrian clergy sometimes clashed with royal authority, while regional tensions and succession disputes simmered beneath the surface. The empire also remained locked in cycles of conflict with Rome, soon to be Byzantium, which would intensify in the coming centuries. These prolonged struggles, though often inconclusive, drained resources and tested the resilience of both states. Nevertheless, the early Sasanian era stands as a period of Persian Renaissance, a deliberate revival of imperial strength, cultural identity, and religious cohesion. It was a time when Persia reasserted its place as a dominant force in the ancient world, not only in military terms, but as a beacon of civilization and governance. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, the Sasanian Empire had established itself as the dominant power in the east, while the Roman Empire had evolved into the Byzantine Empire in the west. What followed was a protracted and intense struggle between these two great civilizations, a rivalry that spanned more than 2 centuries. It was not merely a military contest, but a geopolitical and cultural duel fought through battles, treaties, proxy wars, and shifting alliances. Though neither side would fully conquer the other, their long conflict would drain both empires and prepare the ground for a new era. The roots of this rivalry lay in centuries of Roman-Persian hostility, but the Sasanian period introduced new dimensions. Unlike the more decentralized Parthian state, the Sasanians were centrally organized, religiously unified under Zoroastrianism, and ideologically committed to the idea of a divinely sanctioned monarchy. Their rulers believed themselves not merely to be kings of Iran, but the defenders of truth, Asher, against chaos, Druj, a worldview that gave political conflicts a cosmic weight. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the Roman Empire, likewise viewed itself as the center of civilization and Christian orthodoxy. Its emperors claimed universal authority, and its theologians viewed Zoroastrianism as a pagan rival. These ideological oppositions, Zoroastrian versus Christian, East versus West, amplified the already sharp political and strategic tensions between the two empires. Early Sasanian-Byzantine conflicts were frequent but localized. The empires often fought over the control of buffer states like Armenia and Iberia in modern-day Georgia. These regions were culturally mixed and religiously contested, and both empires sought to place sympathetic rulers on their thrones. When diplomacy failed, skirmishes and full-scale invasions followed. During the 5th and 6th centuries CE, a pattern emerged. Periods of warfare followed by negotiated peace. Treaties were signed and broken. Tribute was exchanged and prisoners were ransomed. The frontiers, particularly along the Euphrates and in the Caucasus, became heavily fortified. Persian cities like Ctesiphon and Byzantine strongholds such as Dara and Edessa became focal points of military operations. Despite the hostility, there were also moments of cooperation. Both empires faced internal religious dissent and external threats from nomadic peoples such as the Huns and various Turkic tribes. Occasionally, they coordinated efforts to manage these challenges. However, such cooperation was always temporary, quickly overridden by the deeper rivalry. The conflict escalated during the reign of Khosrow I, also known as Anushirvan, who ruled in the 6th century CE. Khosrow was one of the most capable and ambitious of the Sasanian kings. He reformed taxation, strengthened the bureaucracy, and invested in infrastructure, including the construction of new roads and bridges. His court became a center of learning, attracting scholars, physicians, and philosophers from across the known world. Khosrow also proved a formidable military leader. During his reign, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian sought to expand his influence in the east while waging wars in the west. Khosrow exploited the distraction to press Sasanian claims in Armenia and Mesopotamia. The two empires engaged in multiple conflicts, including the so-called Iberian War and the Lazic War, both of which centered on control of strategic mountain passes and trade routes. Although these wars were grueling, neither side achieved a decisive victory. Eventually, both Justinian and Khosrow agreed to a truce, and a 50-year peace treaty was signed. However, the peace was short-lived. New Byzantine emperors eager to assert dominance reopened hostilities, and Khosrow's successors resumed the cycle of war. The most dramatic phase of the Sasanian-Byzantine conflict came during the early 7th century CE under the reign of Khosrow II, often called Khosrow Parviz. His reign began with a Byzantine-backed coup that briefly displaced him. With military assistance from the Byzantine Emperor Maurice, Khosrow reclaimed his throne. In gratitude, he concluded a lasting peace and returned previously disputed territories. However, when Maurice was assassinated and replaced by the usurper Phocas, Khosrow used the event as a pretext to launch a massive invasion. The Sasanian armies swept through the Levant, capturing Damascus and Jerusalem, and even seized the relic of the True Cross, a powerful Christian symbol. They continued westward into Egypt, capturing Alexandria and securing control of the grain supply. At its peak, Khosrow's empire controlled more territory than at any time since the Achaemenid era. The Byzantines were thrown into crisis. Their empire was divided, bankrupt, and militarily overwhelmed. However, a new leader emerged, Heraclius, a general who seized power in Constantinople and launched a daring counter-offensive. Over several years, Heraclius reformed the Byzantine military, introduced new fiscal policies, and began a campaign that would turn the tide of war. Heraclius's campaign was not only militarily effective, but psychologically strategic. He invaded Persian territory directly, sacked key cities, and even reached the sacred fire temples of Zoroastrianism. By bringing the war to Persia's heartland, he undermined Khosrow's authority and caused unrest among the Persian nobility. In the year 627 CE, Heraclius defeated the Persian army at the Battle of Nineveh. The victory shattered Persian morale and exposed the weakness of Khosrow's rule. Soon after, Khosrow was overthrown in a palace coup led by his son Kavad II, who immediately sued for peace. The treaty that followed restored the borders to their pre-war lines and returned all conquered territories and relics, including the True Cross. But the damage to both empires was immense. Decades of war had exhausted resources, depopulated cities, and strained social structures. The Persian state, in particular, was left politically fragmented and economically fragile. After Kavad's brief rule, a series of weak and short-lived monarchs took the throne, further destabilizing the Sasanian regime. The rivalry that had shaped the region for centuries was coming to an end, but neither side would emerge as the true victor. Just as the Sasanian and Byzantine empires began to recover from their mutual devastation, a new force arose to the south, united Arab tribes under the banner of Islam. By the early 7th century BCE, the once mighty Sasanian Empire stood precariously on the edge of collapse. Decades of costly warfare with the Byzantine Empire, internal revolts, dynastic instability, and overtaxed provinces had left Persia vulnerable. In this weakened state, the empire encountered a force unlike any it had faced before. An emerging religious and political power from the Arabian Peninsula united under the teachings of Islam. When the Prophet Muhammad began preaching in Mecca in the early 7th century, few could have imagined that within a single generation, his followers would bring down one of the world's great empires. But the message of Islam, its call for monotheism, unity, and moral renewal, rapidly gained adherents among Arab tribes. Upon Muhammad's death, leadership passed to a series of caliphs who expanded Muslim rule beyond the Arabian heartland with remarkable speed. At first, the Arab Muslim forces focused their energies inward and on local rival tribes. However, once internal unity was achieved, the early caliphs, beginning with Abu Bakr and followed by Umar ibn al-Khattab, launched military campaigns that pushed beyond Arabia into the territories of the two great neighboring empires, Byzantium in the west and the Sasanian Empire in the east. The Sasanians at this point were no longer ruled by a strong central authority. The death of Khosrow Laku had unleashed a wave of dynastic struggles. In the span of just a few years, multiple claimants to the throne rose and fell. Royal power fractured, and the court lost control over the provinces. Local governors and aristocratic families began acting independently, making unified defense against external threats nearly impossible. The first major clash between the Muslim Arabs and the Sasanians occurred during the reign of Caliph Umar, whose leadership ushered in a period of coordinated and aggressive expansion. The Arabs had several advantages: highly mobile armies accustomed to desert warfare, religious motivation that energized their troops, and commanders who understood how to exploit Sasanian weakness. The Battle of Dukar, which occurred even before the full-scale invasions, had already demonstrated that Sasanian forces could be beaten by Arab tribes. Though small in scale, this skirmish emboldened the Arab tribes and laid the psychological groundwork for larger campaigns. In the year 633 CE, Muslim forces invaded Sasanian-controlled Iraq, then known as the province of Asuristan. The Persian governor, Rostam Farrokhzad, attempted to coordinate a response but was constrained by the political chaos in the capital. Initial battles, such as those at Namarak and Ulay, ended in Muslim victories, with the Sasanian forces struggling to regroup. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in the early 640s CE. Rostam Farrokhzad led the Sasanian army, which included war elephants and heavy cavalry, against a smaller but well-organized Muslim force under the command of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. The battle lasted several days and ended in a catastrophic defeat for the Persians. Rostam was killed, and the Sasanian army collapsed. This battle was a turning point. It opened the gates to Ctesiphon, the imperial capital. The city, once a jewel of Persian grandeur, was abandoned and fell into Muslim hands without significant resistance. Its palaces, treasuries, and archives were taken over, and the fall of Ctesiphon symbolized the end of centralized Sasanian rule. Yet the resistance did not end there. The final Sasanian monarch, Yazdegerd III, a young and inexperienced ruler, fled eastward, hoping to rally support in the provinces of Media, Parthia, and eventually Khorasan. For several years he moved from city to city, seeking to build an army capable of reversing the Arab advances. Local governors sometimes offered him sanctuary, but few had the resources or the loyalty to support a prolonged resistance. Meanwhile, Muslim forces pursued the retreating Sasanian remnants, capturing major cities along the way. The Battle of Nahavand in the mid-640s marked the effective end of organized Persian resistance. Known in later Islamic tradition as the Victory of Victories, this battle crushed the last major Sasanian army and cleared the path for Muslim expansion into the Iranian plateau. Yazdegerd III continued to flee eastward, eventually reaching Merv, a city in modern-day Turkmenistan. There he hoped to regroup and perhaps find foreign allies, such as the Turks or Chinese, who might intervene on his behalf. However, his hopes were in vain. Local support faded, and in the year 65p1 CE, Yazdegerd was assassinated by a local miller, reportedly for his royal jewels and clothing. With his death, the Sasanian royal line came to an end, and Persia passed into a new era. The Muslim conquest of Persia was not merely a military transition, it was a profound civilizational transformation. The old Zoroastrian elite lost their privileged status. Many temples were closed or converted, and the fire cult that had been central to Sasanian ideology entered a long period of decline. However, the change was not instantaneous nor absolute. In many regions, Zoroastrian communities continued to function for generations. Persian administrators and scholars were employed by the new Muslim rulers. Elements of Persian court culture, literature, and bureaucracy were absorbed into the Islamic Caliphate. The Umayyads and later the Abbasids would adopt many Persian customs, and Persian officials played major roles in the formation of Islamic governance. Furthermore, the Persian language, although initially displaced by Arabic in official domains, survived and eventually flourished once again. Middle Persian gave way to New Persian, which became a vehicle for Islamic literature, philosophy, and historical writing. Over time, Iran became a center of Islamic civilization, producing poets, scientists, theologians, and historians who shaped the Muslim world. While the political structure of the Persian Empire came to an end, the cultural and intellectual legacy of Persia did not disappear. In fact, it evolved, merged with the Islamic tradition, and re-emerged in new forms. Iranian identity, shaped by centuries of imperial history, religion, and language, continued to assert itself in the new world that followed. The fall of the Sasanian Empire in the mid-7th century CE marked the end of Persian political independence for several centuries, but not the end of Persia. Though Arab Muslim forces had dismantled the structures of imperial rule, they did not erase the legacy of the Persian empires that had come before. The influence of Persia, its administrative practices, religious ideas, artistic styles, and cultural memory continued to shape the Islamic world and, eventually, the broader contours of global civilization. The first and most immediate impact of Persia's imperial legacy was felt within the newly emerging Islamic Caliphate. The Umayyads, who succeeded Muhammad's initial successors, relied heavily on Persian bureaucrats, scribes, and local elites to manage the vast territories they now controlled. In regions such as Iraq, Fars, and Khorasan, the infrastructure and governance systems developed under the Sasanians remained largely intact. Even if the ruling class had changed, this continuity was not accidental. The Sasanians had created a sophisticated model of state administration, with hierarchies of officials, systems of taxation, and written records. The Muslim conquerors recognized the value of these tools and adapted them for their own purposes. Persian officials helped organize the Diwan, the administrative register that became central to Islamic governance. Language also played a significant role in the preservation of Persian influence. While Arabic became the dominant language of religion, law, and scholarship in the early Islamic period, Persian did not vanish. Middle Persian, the language of the Sasanians, gradually gave way to a new literary language, New Persian, written in Arabic script but infused with pre-Islamic vocabulary, poetic structures, and idioms. By the 9th century CE, Persian re-emerged as a powerful literary and cultural language under the Abbasid Caliphate. The eastern provinces of the Islamic world, particularly those in Iran and Central Asia, became centers of intellectual and artistic revival. This period saw the flowering of Persian literature, with poets like Rudaki and Ferdowsi drawing deeply from ancient traditions while expressing them in a new Islamic context. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, or Book of Kings, written in the late 10th and early 11th centuries CE, stands as the clearest example of this cultural revival. Composed in over 50,000 couplets, the Shahnameh recounts the mythic and historical past of Iran, from the creation of the world to the fall of the Sasanian Empire. While deeply Islamic in form and setting, the poem is rooted in Zoroastrian and pre-Islamic lore and served as a vehicle for preserving Persian identity in a changing world. Beyond literature, Persian ideas shaped the philosophical and religious life of the Islamic world. Zoroastrian dualism, with its emphasis on the struggle between light and darkness, good and evil, influenced Islamic theological debates. Concepts such as divine justice, the moral responsibilities of kings, and the cyclical nature of history found resonance among Muslim thinkers. The concept of kingship itself, Shahanshah, or King of Kings, did not disappear after the fall of the Sasanians. Instead, it was inherited and reinterpreted by later Islamic dynasties of Persian origin, such as the Samanids, Buyids, and eventually the Safavids. These rulers, though Muslim in faith, often drew on ancient Persian models of court ritual, ceremony, and legitimacy. They saw themselves not only as political leaders, but as guardians of a Persian cultural tradition that predated Islam. The architectural and artistic legacies of the Persian empires also endured. The grand palaces of the Sasanians, with their domes, vaults, and intricate stucco work, inspired later Islamic architecture. The layout of mosques, caravanserais, and public gardens reflected a blending of Arab and Persian styles. Decorative motifs from Achaemenid and Sasanian art appeared in ceramics, metalwork, and textiles produced across the Islamic world. Even the idea of empire, with its centralized administration, territorial ambition, and cultural pluralism, remained a powerful ideal. The Abbasid Caliphate, which moved its capital to Baghdad, close to the old Sasanian center of Ctesiphon, was in many ways a continuation of Persian imperial tradition under Islamic rule. The court life of the Abbasids, their ceremonies, and even their titles bore the mark of Sasanian influence. In Central Asia, the legacy of Persia extended through the Turkic and Mongol periods as well. Dynasties such as the Ghaznavids, Seljuks, and Timurids all adopted Persian as the language of high culture and administration. Persian poets, scholars, and scientists flourished in courts from Samarkand to Delhi, keeping alive the memory and intellectual vitality of ancient Iran. On a deeper level, the Persian empires, especially the Achaemenids, Parthians, and Sasanians, had demonstrated a model of governance that valued tolerance, adaptability, and long-term cohesion. They had ruled over diverse populations with different languages, religions, and customs, not by imposing uniformity, but by creating a shared framework of loyalty, law, and cultural exchange. This model profoundly influenced how later empires, from the Ottomans to the Mughals, understood the challenge of ruling diverse societies. The Persian experience showed that imperial strength did not depend solely on military might, but on administrative wisdom, cultural integration, and a vision of history that connected the present to a meaningful past. Even today, modern Iranian identity is deeply shaped by the legacy of the ancient Persian empires. National consciousness in Iran draws not only from Islamic tradition, but from the memory of Cyrus the Great, the grandeur of Persepolis, the resilience of the Parthians, and the enduring influence of the Sasanians. Monuments, literature, and public discourse in modern Iran often reference these earlier eras not as distant relics, but as foundational to the nation's historical continuity. Globally, the legacy of Persia lives on in the ideas it helped propagate. The notion of human rights, for instance, is sometimes linked, albeit anachronistically, to the Cyrus cylinder, an inscription from the 6th century BCE that declared religious tolerance and the restoration of displaced peoples. While the modern interpretation of such texts must be cautious, they reveal a long-standing Persian concern with justice, legitimacy, and the moral responsibilities of power. In reflecting on the entire arc of Persian imperial history, from the tribal beginnings of the Medes and Persians, through the rise and fall of the Achaemenids, the resilience of the Parthians, and the renaissance of the Sasanians, it becomes clear that Persia was never just a geopolitical entity. It was an idea, a vision of civilization that merged power with culture,